Hello, today we're going to be looking at this question: discuss the global economic effects of increasing globalization or free trade. Key thing in the title is that word global. That means that you're going to have to focus on a particular country, but then make reference to another country as you do it, or other countries. What we don't really want to see is lots and lots of countries being referred to. You still need to make it focused on a particular country. And today we're going to look at Bangladesh for that. The other thing that is important here is economic effects. You could write a politics essay here, so do keep it based on economics. Our definitions are going to be globalization and comparative advantage. Do look those up and put those in. And our points are going to be economic growth and employment, and then inequality, as shown in those two diagrams there. To show you some of the data that I have, you can just look around this first. Real growth rates in Bangladesh are very high rates of growth, around 7% or above. It's a member of SAFTA. That is a free trade area with the following countries. That's important to know. It has a very large garment industry, as we can see in that diagram there. 83% of exports, something useful to talk about there. Its share of global GDP is increasing significantly since 2014. Obviously, that high growth rate is doing that. Poverty is going down as GDP per capita is rising. We're seeing low pay, particularly in Bangladesh, one of the lowest paid workers in the world for textile manufacture. We're seeing big export partners in the EU, but also in the US. And have I got more there? No, I haven't. And just finally, what an interesting diagram this one is. This is, be aware of the very long time scale here. We're really interested in globalization after the Second World War. We can see big increases in global inequality measured by the difference between the top 10% and the bottom the bottom income of the bottom 50%. That's quite complicated. The statistical ways of doing this is difficult. But then we also see after the 90s and then going into the 2000s, particularly after the financial crisis, we see a fall, and we see the impact of the BRICS and catch-up growth and so on. So we've got different arguments we can make, which will be really useful. Okay, pause the video. Think about how you can write that point, growth and employment, with as much detail and reference to that diagram and the examples as we can, and come back in a minute. Okay, unpause your video. We've unpaused, we've come back. Just make sure that you've done some work there first. Let's have a look then. Growth and employment. Well, in that diagram, we have a 2-point essay here, so we need a lot of detail, a lot of logical chains of reasoning in our points to make them A-star level, top level for knowledge, application and analysis points. So constant reference to real life examples. I want to first of all link globalization to the theory of comparative advantage. That will make this essay more theoretical. Exports of textiles from Bangladesh to the EU have increased, and you can refer to some of those arguments down there, for example. And its real growth rate we're going to refer to as well, being about 7% in a minute. We could also say its entry into SAFTA would also have improved its export position. Its exports have risen, component of AD, but also we want to shift LRAS as well. So we want to make sure that just add an AD curve label there. We want to make sure that our AD curve is moving, but also because the increase in profits of these local firms. Now, many of these firms are maybe local firms, suppliers possibly to people like Nike. They may also be foreign firms, transnational corporations. Now, however that works, you're going to see an increase in investment. New textile factories, for example, great application there, and that's often through FDI, foreign direct investment. You're going to see, and this is the missing links we often see, You've got a double link here. You've got capital improving because we've got factories, but we've also got specialization and an increase in efficiency as we repeat certain tasks over and over again. We develop economies of scale, external economies of scale, and so the productivity and efficiency within the country is going to rise, probably combined with infrastructure improvements as well, possibly specialized education and so on. Shifting LRAS to the right, they are all components of the productivity and capital, all components of the shifts to LRAS, resulting in an improvement in YF, the full employment level of output. And with that, I'm going to say that that creates a derived demand for labour as well, a long-run growth, and lots of employment going on in the Bangladesh textile industry. So we've got an awful lot there, a really, really developed logical chain of reasoning to get us to that point where we've got 7% growth rates going on and significant employment in the textile industry. Right, pause the video in a second. Overdependence and external shocks. What can you get for that? How could you make that into an argument against? Okay, coming back. Overdependence and external shocks. Well, first thing that occurs to me here is we've got 83% of the garment industry based in one industry, and we have also the exporting nations, if I can just find that, exporting partners, particularly Germany, US and UK. You've got a very high dependence on one industry and one sort of overall group of countries. So that results in overdependence, that focus on one good or one market or one particular group of countries. That may mean then that external shocks in those countries to those markets result in trade disruptions, and what we mean by that is exports falling, and so the recession in a developing country can cause a recession in developed countries results in recessions in developing countries, and we saw that during the 2008 crisis. Balance of payments crisis, we saw that as your exports fall, for example, during the COVID period, for example, you're going to have a very big impact on your economy for the developing countries. And that might result in crises as we saw in, for example, Sri Lanka, where its tourist industry was very badly hit. Developing countries also become very vulnerable to changes in trade policy. If the US changes its trade policy and tariffs certain goods, they may then have significant impacts as a result. And we have seen this happening with friendshoring, nearshoring, globalization, all happening right now. That has big implications for developing countries. Likewise, though, we want to make this a global essay, so we could say that this also has implications for developed countries. The shortage of, for example, certain factors of production due to COVID, because some countries are so dependent on other countries for their supplies, that might mean that production in other countries like Germany, like the UK, is held up. For example, silicon chips was one example of that happening. Right, we'll look for an alternative argument, global inequality and catch-up growth. Now, I always like to argue for first and then against. So we're going to try and find an argument first that inequality will improve. And we want to talk about Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, the BRICS countries, and any other countries like Bangladesh who have been catching up with the developed set of countries. See what you can get with that with reference to that Lorentz curve diagram there, and we will come back in a second. So this is a more difficult argument to make because you've got to make it both ways. Firstly, we're going to see, as we have seen in Bangladesh, diversification in developing countries. So you're moving into, for example, textiles manufacture, or you're going into, for the example, in China, into electronics or cars. You're going into, for example, tourism. They are all resulting in technology transfer plus FDI from rich countries, combined with the low wage rates and low regulation in your country, means that these countries tend to grow faster than developed countries who have higher wage rates, higher regulation. And so percentage share of income of world income of BRICS countries has risen. I should really have found a graphic to show that, but you do have the Bangladesh share of global GDP there rising, resulting in catch-up growth. You do also have this chart here where we can see that the global Gini coefficient is now falling after 1980 as a peak of around about, I think, probably 0.5, I'd have thought, and then going down somewhat. Oh, this is the ratio. Sorry, this is the ratio. This isn't the Gini coefficient. But anyway, you can see a significant fall going down there to 38 times higher from 53 times higher. So you could attribute this to that diversification in developing countries. That shifts the Lorentz curve, LC1 to LC2. It shifts it inwards as the bottom incomes grow, quintiles grow faster than the top. Gap between rich and poor narrows, Gini coefficient down, world inequality falls. There we go. So we see that happening as a result. Now, pause the video in a second. Why might global inequality or national inequality rise in both developed and developing countries? Okay, coming back. Well, we've got an argument against this, and we could shift the Lorentz curve. We did just shift it inwards this way. But we could actually go back out as well. We could find arguments to suggest that that might be true too. We could say that, well, primary product dependency, it's not the case that all countries are China, South Korea, Bangladesh, Cambodia at the moment. Not all countries are doing this. Some countries are left behind. For example, we have many sub-Saharan African countries, for example. If we take Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, it has not diversified. The income elasticity of demand for its exports might be relatively low, so we could refer to the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis there. And therefore, it hasn't, as world income has risen, the percentage change in demand for its exports has not risen as fast as, say, other countries who are exporting tourism, services, or manufactured goods, which tend to have a higher YED. Now, this also may be to an extent to do with natural endowments. Some countries, say for example Nigeria, has grown fast. It has oil. Therefore, it may have caught up with other countries in a way that others may not. So it may be dependent on that. It may depend on government policy. Some countries have developed infrastructure plans and education plans very well. Look at Botswana. It's developed very, very quickly at very high growth rates. So it may be dependent on the degree to which the government has redirected funds from its tax revenue. Also, location and geography. It may be dependent on where you are. Morocco, for example, near to the EU, near to that market. Mexico, near to the US market. It may result in higher growth than other landlocked countries who are far away from export markets. You could argue, so those things are dependent factors. You may argue about those. I think it's quite nice also to argue that actually, rather than just inequality in the world, we might have relative poverty within nations. So we tend to see very big urban-rural inequality in developing countries develop. Shanty towns, for example, the Lewis model, moving farmers to factories in cities, results in big inequality. And to make it a truly global essay, you could then refer to the structural unemployment in developed countries that we've seen. For example, the loss of the UK textiles industry to Bangladesh, that has resulted in a certain section of the population losing their jobs. And if they're not mobile, they don't have those education and skills, they're not geographically mobile, then they may well become structurally unemployed, which results in a drop in income, which results in inequality and relative poverty within the UK. So lots and lots of arguments there. You can see just how far you can extend this. You've just got to be really judicious as to how much of this stuff you talk about. But do get a balance between just talking about Bangladesh and talking about references to other nations as well. Judgment. Well, overall, what set of outcomes do we have? Well, it depends a lot on the local governance in developing countries and developed countries as well. How have governments reacted to this problem? Have governments in rich countries incentivized more education and labour mobility through infrastructure projects, which reduces that structural unemployment? Is the global trading system fair? Are there tariffs in place which penalize poor countries who are primary product dependent? Does it reduce that diversification that we've seen in many of the BRICS countries? And the answer to that is absolutely. EU subsidies on agriculture, huge impact on North African states, for example. And the individual characteristics of countries impacting their comparative advantage, ultimately, it does depend on what your comparative advantage is, and therefore what you gain from globalization. That's all I've got time for. I hope that made sense.